All right, in this lecture, we're going to write unit tests for this function, absolute. So this function takes a number. If the number is positive, it will return the same number. If the number is negative, it will return minus number to make it positive, and otherwise it will return 0. So with absolute, we'll always get a positive number or 0. Now in lib.js, we have more functions, but I have removed them in this lecture so we can focus only on this function. So let's go ahead and write a few unit tests for this function. Now, how many tests do we need here? A basic guideline is that the number of unit tests you have for a given function should be greater than or equal to the number of execution paths. How many execution paths do we have here? Well, here's one execution path. So if the number is positive, this is where we'll exit this function. Here's another execution path. So if the number is negative, this is where we'll exit. And here's the last execution path. So with unit tests, we want to make sure that all the execution paths in a given function are covered. We're testing all the logic thoroughly. So back to lib.test.js. Let's rename our test name. Here we add the name of our function, that is absolute. Now, what is the first test case? That it should return a positive number if input is positive. So should return a positive number if input is positive. Okay? Now, here we need to call this function. So on the top, first we need to import the lib module. So require, go up one level, and load lib. Get it and store it here. Now we call lib.absolute. We need to give it a positive number. What number should we use? We can use 1, we can use 10, we can use 857. It doesn't really matter. But as a best practice, it's better to avoid these magic numbers because someone reading this test, they wonder, where did that number come from? Is it a special number in the domain of the application? No, all we want is a simple positive number. So it's better to use a simple value like 1. So we call this get the result. Now finally, we need to make an assertion. We need to verify that this result is correct. So Jest has another utility function called expect. If you have worked with Jasmine before, you know this function. So we call this function, give our value, in this case, result, and then call another function. We call this function a matcher function. In Jest or Jasmine, we have various matcher functions. I'm going to show you the list of them in a second. In this test, we want to ensure that this result is equal to 1. So we call to_be 1. So see, this is very readable. Expect result to be 1. Now let's run this test. So back in the terminal, npm test. Okay, our first test passed successfully. Beautiful. Now let me show you these matcher functions. So search for Jest documentation. Here's the first link, facebook.github.io/jest/docs. So here on the left side, on the top, you can see using matchers. Now on this page, if you scroll down, you can see we have matcher functions for checking for truthiness. For example, we have to be null, to be undefined, to be defined, to be truthy, and to be falsy. Below that, you can see the matchers for working with numbers. So in this lecture, we used to be. We also have to equal. You're going to see the difference between these two functions later in this section. We also have other matcher functions like to be greater than or equal, to be less than, and finally to be less than or equal. Now, if you're working with floating point numbers, because of how floating point numbers are stored in computers, we cannot do an exact equality check. So here is an example. We have a floating point number, 0.3. We want to expect this value to be close to 0.3. So we cannot use to be or to equal here. Remember that. So these are the matchers for testing numbers. Now, back to our unit test. This was our first execution pass or first test case. We need to duplicate this, create the second test case. Now let's rename this test. So absolute should return a positive number if input is negative. Now this time we pass -1 and we expect to get +1. So back in the terminal, npm test. Okay, now we have 2 passing tests. Beautiful. And finally, the last test. Let's duplicate this. Absolute should return 0 if input is 0. So we give it 0 and we expect to get 0. Save. Back in the terminal. Let's run this one more time. And now we have 3 passing tests. Beautiful. Now let me show you something. I'm going to go back to our last test. And on this line, I'm going to change this value to 1. Now this test should fail. So let's have a look. npm test. Okay, we have a failing test. Now look at this guideline. Expected value to be 1, but we received 0. So as your tests fail, look for these messages to troubleshoot the problem. Sometimes the problem is in your test. Sometimes the problem is in your production code. So we have written 3 tests for this function. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to group our tests.